So I get to be here today with Dr. Richard Miller, and I have to say it's lovely to see you and have this opportunity. I haven't had many times where I could talk very directly with Richard, but I have known of you and really admired your work for a really long time now. I want to just give a little background on who you are before we dive into some
Mhm.
topics. So for those that don't know you, Richard is a doctor of clinical psychology, an author, a researcher, yogic scholar, spiritual teacher. Since the 1960s, you devoted your life to integrating Western psychology and neuroscience with the ancient non-dual wisdom teachings of yoga, Tantra, Advaita, Taoism, and Buddhism. And you're the founder and president of iRest Institute, the co-founder of the International Association of Yoga Therapists, founding member and past president of the Institute for Spirituality and Psychology, author of numerous books on iRest meditation, health and healing well-being, programs dealing with PTSD, Yoga Nidra, the Meditative Heart of Yoga. Your iRest Yoga Nidra has been used as research and been used also with the military, yes,
Mhm.
with diverse populations, working with veterans, women rescued from human trafficking, youth, the homeless, incarcerated, people dealing with sleep issues, again, PTSD, pain and chemical dependency. And there's lots of grounded research studies. I just think what you've been doing and how you blend the ancient wisdoms and the current knowledge of anything that we know in Western science has been exquisite, really exquisite.
Well,
Thank you.
it's been a deeply rich and varied life.
Yeah,
So,
and I'm hoping that we can talk about that a bit today because
mhm,
though I could know this about you by finding information online, I don't think a
mhm,
lot of people get the opportunity to hear about maybe your early days or what got you so deeply into yoga and who your most influential teachers might
mhm,
have been and
mhm.
are.
Yes. Happy to go any which way you'd like, Tara, and it's lovely being here with you as well. Thank you for
Thank you.
inviting me on.
Pleasure. I also want to say that you were part of the book that I did with Larry Payne and Eden Goldman for yoga therapy and integrative medicine. So that's partly how I got most introduced to your early work. I also want to say you had big impact on a friend of mine, William Rodriguez, who I met
Mhm.
through you and Larry Payne, and he became a very dear friend. And he was one of the, I think, one of the early vets that were trained in iRest.
He was indeed. Yes. Yeah.
Great. So, what can you share about what your influences have been and what drew you to this weaving of Western psychology and Eastern mysticism and sacred sciences?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. When I look back on my early years, I spent a lot of time in nature. So climbing trees. I lived outside of the town where I grew up, so there were lots of forests around, and I'd hang out with the squirrels and the birds. And in those days, there were no locks on the doors. There was no fear about me being 6 years old and just going out for hours by myself. And I found myself often now looking back in nature being in a very deep place of stillness.
Mhm.
Then I had a couple of experiences along the way. One when I was 13 down in Florida during a spring vacation, lying at night, looking up into the skies and trying to imagine, as I guess a 13-year-old would, where's the end of the universe? And I came to a brick wall, jumped over it, came to another brick wall, jumped over it. And I kept doing that over and over again. And all of a sudden, everything I would say exploded into an experience of unity where I didn't feel myself separate from anything. It was a wondrous moment. And then I went back into being a 13, 14, 15-year-old with all the struggles and difficulties. But again, in my early years, when I was about 22, I had another experience similar to that with a mentor who I met who was teaching me the art of psychotherapy. She was from the Far East and introduced me to a lot of what I now know as meditation. And so it was really through those deep experiences that gave me a sense of awe, wonderment, a deep sense of peace. In then one other experience, I'll say in 1970, when I was first living in San Francisco and I took a yoga class, I was introduced to the rudiments of Yoga Nidra. And at the end of that class, I had another unit of experience walking out feeling at home in the universe with a deep, I would say, peace that just helped me feel totally at ease. And so I was really left through all those experiencing, wondering how can I continue to experience this? What techniques or practices could I engage in? And it slowly led me into different teachers who showed me from the Taoist perspective. I had a Chinese teacher from China. In the yoga perspective, I had a number of teachers from India. From the Western psychological experience with my mentor, who was both trained in Western and Eastern perspectives of, we might say, psychology and spirituality. They all blended together in a magnificent way that there came a moment, 1996, I think it was. I woke up about 2 in the morning, couldn't sleep, so I sat by the window that was outside our bedroom. And I had this moment of realizing what I would call our essential nature, my essential nature, that I recognized all those early experiences were helping me really see that or experience it. And since that moment, I would say that deep peace has never left. It's
Mm-hmm.
accompanied me in every moment, not as something now I'm trying to achieve or strive or do, but it's doing me is the best way I could say it. And I love there's a kind of a shift that happens from what is it that I'm doing or what is it that I want to do to what is it that life is doing as it's living me.
Beautifully
So
said.
just
I
a,
understand the difference, and
yeah,
I so appreciate you wording it that way.
yeah, it's just a lovely, I wouldn't even say it's a surrender. It's just something that comes naturally to us. And we realize there is a deep peace that's unbreakable and that accompanies us in every moment. And that's what I've discovered, whether I've been in grief or sadness or struggling with some challenge in life, that deep peace has continued unbroken.
I'm curious because you have done so much research now with iRest, which blends Yoga Nidra with some with psychology. Yes, would
Mhm.
you describe it that way? Uh,
Yeah.
how would you describe it?
Well, first let's define Yoga Nidra. Yoga to me means actually that realization of that deepest essence or peace. And Nidra, while it means a state of sleep, it means any changing state of consciousness. So
Mhm,
Yoga Nidra is a practice I've learned helps us contact that deep ease and deep peace and then integrate it into every experience we may have in life. So we see that it's an unbroken thread through all of our experiences. Along the way, because I was very interested in medicine, you're a licensed acupuncturist. I was actually on my way to become a licensed acupuncturist, did some clinical work actually in India with my acupuncture skills. But when I came back from India, I realized psychology was really where I wanted to land. And so, with some of my mentors, I was able to integrate both the Western perspectives that I was learning with the Eastern perspectives
mhm,
and integrate them. And then, when I really dove into the teachings of Yoga Nidra that we find in a lot of the different Upanishads and sacred teachings from India, it offered me what I would call a tree where I could basically see every teaching that I had ever experienced as branches or leaves hanging on that basic trunk to that tree. So it provided me the opportunity to look at everything I'd learned in Western psychology and Eastern spirituality and see the integration through this, what we call the teachings of Yoga Nidra, which I've also incorporated into what I do, the teachings that come out of a non-dual perspective of yoga. So it's a compilation of the teachings of Yoga Nidra and a teachings, what I call now the map of meditation that comes from the ancients and has been given to us in a
I,
wonderfully simplified manner.
I appreciate what you're saying. And funny, when I chose Chinese med school, I almost chose to be a psychologist. Instead, I trained with someone named Jack Rosenberg, who you might have known of because he was a
Mm-hmm.
Gestalt, you know who he is. I
Yes.
trained with him for 5 years and trained in integrative body psychotherapy, but chose to get my licensing in Chinese medicine because I wanted to touch people. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to have the limitation of not touching. And back then, there were rigid rules around that, even more than now, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but it's when diving into these traditions, there is a place where they can go dual, or they can go deep enough, and it's
Mm-hmm.
all going non-dual at a certain point, I
Yeah.
find. Uh,
Yeah, and for me, what I've come to appreciate is the non-dual teachings, which really help us feel a sense of everything is a part of ourselves. We're not separate from everything around us, but it incorporates that sense of separation as well. So I love that we can have an exquisite understanding and recognition of our diversity, and yet feel and in touch with this that we all share in common as our basic humanity. But it is also that which we share with the trees and the animals and everything around us that I felt when I was a young child, but now realize as an adult.
mhm. It's lovely. And what I'm hearing is that it's very natural, right? That meditation or a state of yoga nidra is a natural state. That it's
Well, you come upon, I think, the real extraordinary experience, which is what we're trying to achieve through meditation, we already are. So it's not an achievement, it's more of a recognition that one day, as I did in 1996, we realized the simplicity of it. It's always been here. It's what I would say is our nearest,
Mhm.
but it gets obscured through our thinking mind and how we've been conditioned by our family, our culture. And so we tend not to recognize it except in tiny little glimpses. Often people call it the flow state or
Mhm.
a peak experience, but people don't understand that it's always here. It's not a peak experience, it's actually our native natural state.
Mhm.
But it's so near, we miss it because we're always looking out at something rather than turning inward and really recognizing what's already and always here amidst all the changing circumstances.
Thank you. One of the things I recognized when I started really exploring your iRest work and seeing how it's scripted, because of course they're scripting to teach people a structure so that then they can go beyond
Mm-hmm.
that, right? It's one way to teach. And what I recognized was the integration of the Mayas, or some people call them the Koshas, in a way that recognizes different aspects of what it means to be a being, rather than just coming from the thinking mind and how we process or
Mm-hmm.
perceive life. And
Yeah.
I personally have attributed that 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 system as why I think your work is so effective, and it actually inspired me in my own clinical practice with patients, and I educate them on that model because I can't imagine how we can have full being healing experiences without acknowledging different aspects of what it means to be a being, or where to come from, how to heal
Yes.
different layers. Is there
Well,
anything
that
you can
that
speak to about that?
well, I think of when you, as you're talking that word Maya, Maya, which many people may not know, it means the word actually in Sanskrit in English means appearing as. So, that we have these different sheaths or koshas, as you're saying, the body. So we identify with it. So it appears as if we are the body. But when we really investigate the body through meditation, we come upon, say, a blurring of what we would call the boundaries of the skin, because if we close our eyes and we feel where is the outermost boundary of our body, we all of a sudden realize it's unbounded. And the same thing, our mind, we identify with our emotions and our thoughts. So we appear as if I am my emotions. So we say, I'm angry, I'm sad, or I'm hungry. But in fact, what's really going on is hunger is arising, a thought is arising, an emotion is arising. And if we can really see that it is arising, then we can inquire, well, who am I in which it is arising? And we may ultimately come to this recognition that we're actually a quality of unbounded awareness that's unchanging, in which the emotions, the body, the senses, all that we usually take ourselves to be is arising and falling away. And one day we may realize, instead of attending to the koshas, the emotions, the body, the senses, tension turns inward to awareness, which isn't an object. We can't see awareness as we would see an object, but we are being awareness, we would say. And in that moment, when we awaken to being awareness, there's a radical shift that happens in our psyche. And then what I see that follows is all these natural expressions of ease and peace and well-being, kindness, compassion. They literally start to flow out of us as expressions of our natural state. So Yoga Nidra is an exquisite practice that helps us see all the things we normally take ourselves to be, that ultimately we realize while we have a body, we're more than the body. We have senses, we're more than the senses. Emotions, we're more than the emotions. But I'd love to add one more thing, because Yoga Nidra, while it enables us to recognize and awaken to our natural state, as you're saying, our essential nature, this deep peace, it also gives us the skills from which then to navigate the body, senses, emotions, and mind, that oftentimes people then, when they have a momentary awakening into pure awareness, they go back in their conditioned emotions and get caught in the machinations of daily life. I think we need both a practice that gives us a sense of awakening to our true nature, but also gives us the tools, the skills or tool belt in which then to navigate our daily life. And that's what I've found in these practices of Yoga Nidra, that so beautifully integrate the Eastern and the Western teachings and give us that tool belt, an owner's manual, I like to call it, that we weren't given at birth. I wasn't, at least, but reveals it to us, and we can learn those skills then.
As you're saying that, the word that kept coming to me was remembering.
Yes. Yeah.
Remembering, and it is a moment-to-moment practice, isn't it? Daily moment-to-moment practice.
It is, and there's a beautiful moment where we put in a lot of effort, don't we, initially, in learning any practice or skill, but there comes a moment where there's a shift, and all of a sudden we realize I'm no longer remembering, it's remembering me. And that's when we can truly relax and realize that in each moment we do have an inbuilt perfect response to the moment, if we can step away from our conditioning and really see the authentic, very deep and intimate response that's always here. We may get scared, because when we really let life lead the way, we realize more and more we're out of control. It's life that is in control, and our mind and our conditioning may want us to go in one way, and life is saying, no, I'm sorry, we're going in a different direction, which puts us squarely into the unknown. But that's also where our true aliveness is, and our true authenticity, and really that real deep sense of where our life has meaning, purpose, and value, without or beside whatever it is we're doing. We can really discover that through these wonderful, exquisite practices.
I'm really enjoying hearing how you articulate these states of consciousness, because you have a language for it that isn't always easily found. And it's a path even for me to just keep trusting that it can come through. And it clearly comes through you really effortlessly. So thank you. Really, it's a gift.
It's been a long learning, because I've worked with so many different people from cultures and different backgrounds. And so I'm always trying to look at what's the language that a particular person relates to, rather than imposing some
Right.
spiritual or psychological lingo. I'm really trying to always interview the person I'm working with. What's the wording and the language that best resonates with them? And once I can learn their language, then we can have a really exquisite discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find that that really is yoga, right? That's the relationship aspect.
Well, it reminds me when I started working at Walter Reed Army Medical Center back in 2004, and they said, lose the word yoga nidra. We do not do yoga and we don't meditate. We're military. And so that's when I came up with the word integrative restoration, or iRest. And they came back to me and they said, well, we can do that. We can do iRest, but
Uh-huh.
we don't do yoga nidra. What's so funny is several years later, after our pioneering research with Walter Reed, they came back to me and they said, you know what? We love what you're doing. We like this iRest, but you can also call it yoga nidra if you want.
We'll embrace you now.
So it's nice to see how, we may start with a particular languaging that works with a person, but once they really have the experience, they say, I don't care what you call it. I've got the understanding and the experience.
Yes. Yeah. And what's great though is I think that because you did call it iRest, though, it has opened it up to, like you said, different communities that maybe wouldn't have been as open to yoga.
Well, I've gone into shelters, homeless shelters, addiction centers, both with men and women, children. And we've got to have languaging that makes it accessible. And yeah, I found that using the word iRest, like if I was sitting on an airplane, I did this test for many years, and somebody would say, well, where are you going? And I'd say, well, I'm going to go do a yoga retreat. And they would say, oh, I need to do more exercise.
Right.
All of a sudden I was in a box.
Right.
Or if I said, well, I'm going to a meditation retreat, they'd say, oh, I need to learn how to relax.
Uh-huh.
But if I said, I'm going to an iRest retreat, they always said, well, what's that?
Hmm.
Now I had an opening. I wasn't in a box,
Hmm.
and I could really begin to explain in a way that they would often say, oh, well, can you say more about that? Whereas if I just say, I'm doing yoga, often they close the conversation right down. They knew what I was doing when in fact they really didn't. So
Right.
I'm always looking for a word that, I like the idea of being on an elevator and I punch the first button and the person turns to me and says, well, what's iRest? And I want to say it in such a way they say, well, let's go to the second floor. Tell me more. And then we go to the third floor and the fourth floor because they keep asking, well, tell me more about that, versus using a word that closes off the conversation.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, speaking about how to close off or how to open, I wanted to ask you about pranayama because clearly that is a piece of iRest work, but also
Mhm.
it's been something that you've decided is important enough to lead a whole training on for this coming year in 2022. And I smiled big when I saw that because I've been feeling, especially in the midst of all the things going on in the world, that of all the practices, it seems that breath work is really essential and important for people to better understand the uses of. And I
Mhm.
know, I trust that you will present it in a way that is a good blend of Eastern and Western perspectives. Can you speak
Mhm.
to that?
Love to. The word pranayama, as you know, prana means this life force that's animating not only ourselves, but the plants, the animals, we would say the entire cosmos. And yama or ayama is a word in Sanskrit that means to extend our understanding and attain a certain control over that life force. So pranayama is the science that enables us to harness that life force through the breath and use it for healing or for well-being or for awakening. So when I teach it, as I'll be doing in this year-long course you mentioned, I'm going to be looking at both the Eastern and the Western science behind pranayama. I've done a lot of research looking at the Western view of respiratory and cardiovascular well-being or health and how the breath influences that. I've looked at the Eastern perspective of how do they use pranayama both to stabilize a sense of well-being, but also to use it to awaken to our essential nature, as we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So from the Western perspective, we know that lengthening the exhalation enables our body and our respiratory cardio function to come into a what we might call a coherence, where they're all operating smoothly and efficiently. So, for instance, when we inhale, the blood is being pulled into our heart and our lungs. When we exhale, it's being sent out to our extremities. By breathing properly, people who have cold feet, cold hands can learn how quickly to warm their hands, warm their feet.
Mm-hmm.
People who are having stress can quickly learn how to deepen a sense of relaxation and well-being. So there are a lot of exquisite practices that come out of both Western physiology of respiration and Eastern understandings of respiration. The other thing I love to reveal is how when we exhale and we come to that moment where the breath basically dissolves, it's an exquisite moment to feel a deep stillness.
Mm-hmm.
It's always there, that when the inhalation comes, we can return with that stillness during the inhalation. So
Kubaka,
each
yeah?
so each pause is a remembering, as you're using the word, of our essential nature, which the breath exquisitely points to.
Yeah.
And I want to look at also, how do we use the breath for healing? So people with asthma or respiratory illnesses, but it could also be migraine or an arrhythmia, or I've got people joining me with COPD. How do we use the breath to really stabilize and enhance our sense of health when we've got some dis-ease going on? How do we use it all day long to basically embody a sense of well-being? And how do we use it in meditation to stabilize the mind so we can go beyond the mind, we might say, and realize that deeper essential nature? So they're exquisite practices. I've been doing this practice, gosh, since 1970, almost on a daily basis. And it's as simple as a 12 to 20-minute practice. I do it about 12 to 20 minutes every day. I've explored doing it as long as an hour or two a day just to stretch my understanding. But for most people, 10, 12 minutes a day is going to be enough to really begin to restore a sense of well-being and health. And then they can tap into that all day long. I remember in the 70s when I was learning it, I actually bought one of these new watches where you could set an hourly timer on it. And so at the end of each hour, when the signal would go off, wherever I was, I would check in, what's my breathing doing? And I would shift from an upper respiratory to a lower abdominal breathing, lengthen my exhale, and reinstall that sense of well-being. Because we know when we're in stress, when we're under duress, we tend to go into an upper respiratory, more hyperventilation kind of breathing that can put us into fight, flight modality. Whereas when we can quickly shift back into that abdominal diaphragmatic breathing, we can step out of fight, flight, stress syndromes into a more relaxed ease that then we can bring into the stressful situation we might be encountering. So it's a powerful modality. I love the simplicity of it. I love the complexity of it, and hopefully I'll be helping people delve into the simplicity so they can integrate it into their lives while I'm teaching them the more complex understandings that might give us on our mind an orientation that makes us go, that's a good practice. I want to keep doing that for my life. So I call it breathing for life, and not just breathing for my lifetime, but breathing so that I can have a good life moment to moment.
Love this. Love it. And I'm looking forward to your training. I personally plan on being part of it, and really looking forward to it. I also wanted to say that I work so much with breath work in the ways I've learned, but not in some of the ways you've integrated into your practices together the way you have. So I'm eager to keep learning always. And I also provide a lot of training to my clients And one thing I wanted to say to anyone that really wants to dive in and train with you, that is coming through my friends or my clients, is that I'm offering a bonus that if they sign up with my code with you, that I'm going to do actually even a tongue assessment with each person and give them some overview of some things they can work on, so that when they are working with their breath work, they've maybe done some recalibrations to support their health for even more vital functioning, right?
Mhm.
Based on, if you had background in Chinese medicine, then you know what I'm talking about.
I do, and the tongue is such a fascinating organ because it reveals so much about the state of our health, the way it looks, whether, as you know, whether it's pale or red, whether it's got little serrations in it, and whether it's got curves or indentations. It's a window into our whole health system. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. And I found that during this time of the last pandemic of the year, I worked with people even on Zoom with it, and it was phenomenal how much we could cover and share and work with from a distance, just from understanding the tongue. So I love
Mhm.
to educate people on their tongues, because
Yeah.
there's so much they can do. It's very empowering, actually, to understand how to read your tongue.
Well, I'll also be explaining some of the tongue mudras while we're doing breathing, because our placement of our tongue influences how we may feel throughout the rest of our body. So
Yeah.
the tongue isn't just something that we use for swallowing and talking. It can be used in a lot of different ways, as you're doing with Chinese medicine, and we can do with pranayama.
Yeah, and even thinking about it from a fascial perspective and polyvagal theory perspectives, it's, the tongue plays such a powerful role in how we calibrate and on our voices and our frequency, using our frequencies, right?
It reminds me the way we talk, and breathing is so instrumental in how we talk. The way we talk is actually a reflection of our heart and how we feel in our body. So if we have a resonant or deeper, soft voice, that might be showing the heart is in a tremendous sense of well-being and vagal tone. And if we're in a kind of a squeaky, harsh voice, it may mean that the stress is actually impinging on our cardiovascular system. So
Yeah.
again, the breath, the tongue, the way we speak and use our voice, these are all instrumental. For instance, there's pranayama where we're learning to close the glottis in our throat
Mhm.
or keep it open. And it has a major influence on how we feel and how we are during our day, because a lot of people are constricting the throat.
Yeah.
There was research that was done looking at the breath, and if we can keep our throat muscles actually soft and at ease, our thinking mind will decrease and we'll have more access to a sense of well-being. And all that is part of the science of pranayama.
Yeah, and I always, that's one of the things I've always loved about conscious speaking, but also chanting, right?
Mhm.
Because it is such an expression of our spirit and our heart and
which
soul.
I which I'll also be using. I'll be looking at some of the core sounds we can use to enhance the way we breathe and the way we feel throughout all the different systems in our body.
Well, you're naming all the things I'm passionate about, so I'm definitely going to be there. And I'm really grateful to this time I got to have with you. Thank you so much, Richard.
It's a delight. I'd love to hang out with you more. Maybe some point I'll get down to where you live and we can have a cup of tea and some nice conversation.
Absolutely, or I'll find you. I'll go up there too.
Yeah,
Thank you, and hopefully we will connect soon. And I'm just going to say namaste, and I'm going to end the video, but you can stay for a moment if you have the time.
great. Namaste as well. Thank you very much.